Hello and welcome to the Legislative Report. I'm State Representative Keith Gillespie of the 47th District in York County. The youth of today are the leaders of tomorrow. That's why whether you have a school-age child or not, you should be concerned about their education. Is Pennsylvania giving students the best education possible in the most efficient manner? Do schools have the flexibility that they need to meet these goals? And what can be done to lessen the burden on our taxpayers, especially in growing areas like York County? Here today to give his view on these issues is the Secretary of the Pennsylvania Department of Education, Ron Tomales. Secretary Tomales, welcome to the program.
Representative, good to be with you.
Great to have you here. Now I understand you are actually a native of the area. You grew up in Camp Hill.
That's right.
A couple of daughters, and but actually you're sort of back here. You had been Deputy Secretary of Education under the Ridge administration, but then after that was down in Washington working with the Bush administration on the federal side.
That's right. My experience in education is twofold. I say that because it's really a little bit about where my focus is. I look at the professional side, where during the Ridge administration from 1995 to 2001, I was the #2 official in the department during all those years. And then I left to join the Bush administration down in Washington, and I served as counselor to the United States Secretary of Education, Rod Page. And for those of you who don't know, for those of your viewers who don't know, Rod was the superintendent of the year of the Houston Independent School District, so one of the largest school districts in the country. I served as his counselor, as his advisor, and helped to run a program out there that's gotten in the papers quite a bit lately. It's called the No Child Left Behind Act. I was in charge of implementing that across the nation. About 2 years, I went to 30 states implementing the program. It's about a $30 billion a year program. Left there after the midterm and worked in the private sector, and coming back to Pennsylvania to join Governor Corbett and his team. The other qualification I bring to the table is what you referenced before. I'm a dad. My wife and I have 2 kids in public education, and we're doing and moving back to central Pennsylvania, doing what thousands upon thousands of Pennsylvania parents are doing, and that is trying to find out where we're going to live. And the one thing that we're looking for when we're trying to decide where we're going to live is the quality of schools, of public schools for our kids. So those perspectives, I have a professional side, but I think the one that carries me a little bit more in the job is what I experienced in looking through our public education system through a 9-year-old and 11-year-old.
Yeah, I remember you said it was a 9-year-old and 11-year-old, so they obviously got quite a ways to go with their public education.
They do, and we've been really pleased with the choices that we've been able to make for our kids. They're pretty dynamic kids, pretty exciting kids, and they love school, which they take as much that on certain parts of it. I'm glad to say they take after their mom more than they take after their dad.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Well, certainly this has got to be a little bit of a change coming from almost being in the Beltway. I think you said you were in Howard County down there with an hour and 10-minute commute to back here in Pennsylvania, where it's only going to take you about 10 minutes to get to the office here.
It is. That part of the job I really don't miss. That sometimes on a Friday afternoon you sit in that car and you spend a little bit too much time in that car. And the Washington is, they talk about or President Reagan used to have a phrase that Washington is a beltway surrounded by a sea of reality, and I used to work inside that beltway, and education issues, that's certainly appropriate.
Yeah.
So
we talk about what is the administration's opinion of the education product that Pennsylvania provides? We hate to refer to it as a product, but really it is. I mean, you got these schools which are very close to being like a business. Yeah. With what they're putting out as far as a product.
And it's interesting how you would look at it, how one would look at it, because where I try and focus the attention is that the public education system that we have in Pennsylvania, indeed across the country in over 15,000 school districts, 500 of which here are in Pennsylvania, but the system is a means to an end. How we structure schools and buildings and districts, they've served a great purpose, and we've been pretty comfortable with them for the last 50, 100, 150 years, our public education system. But our focus, if we're not focusing on what I think is the ultimate goal, the ultimate mission, is that child behind that desk in that 3rd grade or 5th grade. If our system isn't serving the needs of that child, then we have to think anew in how our system is structured. And overall, we do a pretty good job in a lot of cases. Our proficiency rates, our grade level rates, they're showing good improvement. The interesting thing about that is most of the improvement in the last 10 years or so have taken part in the early years, not the late years. But still, we have way too many circumstances when 1 out of 4, 1 out of 5 children aren't performing at grade level. And if our goal, if you can make that comparison, if you think for a second, anything else in society where 1 out of 5 or maybe 1 out of 4 times when we're not performing up to standards is considered a great success. There's not too many places where you can look and see that. And when you think that we have to focus on the child, that those children are impacted by our successes or failures, then I think we have to think anew about how we deliver that model.
Yeah, understand. Now, the percentages there would work out to 20 to 25% are not making it, which is significant if you look at it with those numbers. Any initial thoughts of why we're just not capturing those kids at this point?
Well, in those areas where we only have 20 or 25%, but in certain circumstances we have 30, 40, even 50%. And in some individual buildings, the numbers are even more startling and more scary. In some of our schools, it can be 70 to 80% of the children who are not at grade level. Dropout rates are horrendous. Violent issues are very problematic. The difficulty that I have of coming back to Pennsylvania is that many of those school districts, many of those buildings would have been on a list that would have been generated 10, 15 years ago. And here we are 10 or 15 years later, and we're still in too many circumstances facing the same problems. One of the areas where I don't think is the reason is money. Back in 1995, when I started in my first year in the Ridge administration, we were spending $13 billion a year in K-12 public education in the Commonwealth. Commonwealth taxpayer was writing that check every single year. If we would have just stayed with inflation, right now in 2011, we'd be spending about $17.5 billion a year, but we're not. We're spending $26 billion a year in K-12 education. Yet we have, and census data that just came out last month shows that we have 10% less kids in K-12 education, public education. We have about 5,000 extra employees of our public education system. Money isn't always the driver for success. I mentioned before that statistic about the grades and the increases in student achievement. If you look at all the money that's gone into public education in the last 10 years, I break it down into 2 buckets, basically from 2002 to 2006 and from 2006 to 2010. When you look at the trajectory of the academic growth, there was a lot more growth from 2002 to 2006. From 2006 to 2010, that growth kept going up, but it started to flatten out. Mm-hmm. Most of the money came during the second half of the decade, not the first half of the decade. So most of our achievement happened before most of the money came into the system, or the increases in the money. So for me, there are other things that we need to look at to see what drives our quality education system.
Well, from what I heard with your numbers there, we went from 13 billion to 26 billion when really you're saying it should have been somewhere in the 17 billion dollar range.
I'm saying it should have been. I'm saying if we would have just kept with inflation, yeah, it'd be $17 billion. You can show that we've invested, the taxpayer has invested so much more money into our K-12 system.
Yeah. Okay. The media has often portrayed education as being unfairly treated by the corporate budget. How do you react to that?
Well, the governor was faced with quite a stark challenge when he entered office in January of 2011. And one of the things that happened is in preparing a $27 billion budget, we had $4 billion in a structural hole, a $4 billion hole that had to be fixed. We couldn't paper over that. In fact, one would argue that many of the reasons why we were faced with that hole was because it was papered over, and I'll speak to that in a second specifically as it relates to the stimulus dollars. So we had to take care of fixing that, and the government had to make some very tough decisions. And when 40% of every dollar that is spent in the Commonwealth out of the state government is spent in education, when you're fixing that hole, there's not too many places that you can go to. Now, how did we get in that circumstance? Well, the economy certainly drove a lot of it. But also, the use of the stimulus dollars from 2008 and 2009 and how that was folded into our education budget. Most people don't know, but state funding in K-12 public education was actually cut, and cut severely in 08-09. We have a big pot of money, over $5 billion. It's the biggest chunk of money, the biggest line item that goes down to school districts to support K-12 education in a line item called the Basic Ed Formula, the BEF. That was actually cut by the last administration, but school districts saw an increase. And the reason why the school districts saw an increase is because from the point to the level that it was cut to the actual level was all stimulus, was all federal stimulus dollars. That happened 2 years in a row. So we saw this increase in K-12 spending in public education, but it was bought with a maxed out credit card. And when the federal stimulus dollars went away and the money came and we had no other option, we were down at much lower levels at state dollars. What Governor Corbett proposed and what the legislature agreed to is to raise the dollar spending to above the level, to the level that it was at stimulus. Some of those stories are tough to gather and to talk about in the public when it's a lot easier to say, as reported in the media, that the governor cut and slashed public education. There's a reason why the public education dollars had to take the hit that it did, in large part because of the stimulus.
Because of the stimulus. But didn't actually the money that was proposed and ultimately passed, it adds actually equal to or a little bit better than what it was in 2008, 2009?
Yes, and that's important to remember. It is, because there were some other line items that also took a hit too. But when you look at the amount of money of the increased state dollars in the basic ed format and how much the governor and the legislature enacted when they enacted the budget, how much they rose that, it balances out so that we do see a greater investment. There's some other line items that are very problematic, very difficult, that not just in the current budget, but in years ahead. Pension line item, for example, is going to be a big problem for us as we look to the future. It's a line item in my state budget, in my department's budget. It's about $260, $270 million last year of the 10-11 school year. It jumped to $580 million for this current 11-12 year that was just enacted. It's anticipated to go to $920 million next year, and in the following year it may go as high as $1.3 billion. That's a hard reality that we have to face when we put the budget together.
Right, and certainly something we're going to be looking to address as we go back in the fall. There was some initial stuff that was passed just before the end of last session with changing the multiplier and the enrollment ages and tenure, et cetera. But that is a big issue that's looming out there that we're going to have to be addressed as we go forward.
It is, and it's going to face every taxpayer in the wallet.
Yeah, exactly. Which may be a great segue to the next question. We hear that somewhere between 75 and 80% of the cost of education is driven by salaries and benefits and ultimately the pension.
Representative, you're right. We are a labor-intensive business. Doesn't matter if it's public education or private education. Education, most of the money, most of the costs associated with education covers the cost of salaries and benefits of the employees within the system. In fact, it's the dichotomy. It's a bit of a frustration on my part, because in Pennsylvania we are very much of a local control state, which is great. And most of the costs associated with public education are determined at the local level through the collective bargaining unit agreement. It's not the state that negotiates those contracts. It's local school boards and it's local union representatives. And if you look back over the past couple years and the amount of money that has gone in since the recession began, it's been quite a bit. In fact, since the recession began in 08-09, the amount of money that has gone in raises, just in raises for all employees of our K-12 public education system, is over $1.1 billion, just in raises, while the rest of us were struggling and going through a recession. So we also see, and I applaud the school districts that stepped up to the plate and went for a pay freeze, across the board pay freeze. But we've built in automatic raises, not just what you read in the paper, the 3%, the 4%, but there's step increases that are also included. So a teacher or an employee could be getting a 3% step increase and then another 3% raise on top of it. So the two together, about 6% during some of these tough economic times. That's why we have to look back and we have to see what some of these cost drivers are and see what we can do to control some of those cost drivers.
Absolutely, and like you say, when you take that 6% times the 500 school districts, it's easy to see how you can come up with that $1.1 billion just in the raises. Absolutely. We're going to take a break here. Legislative report will return in just a moment.
Did you know that Fort Indiantown Gap, located in Lebanon County, is home to Pennsylvania's only Veterans Memorial? C.J. Frederick of Westchester, Bucks County, submitted the winning design that now honors those men and women who have sacrificed their lives in defending this great country. Dedicated to the Commonwealth on October 7, 2001, the Veterans Memorial is surrounded by freestanding walls and houses an amphitheater, which can accommodate large crowds during an event. Strategically placed in the front of the amphitheater is a tomb that reminds visitors of those who gave their lives protecting the freedoms of this nation. The design suggests a war-damaged structure in which Frederick wanted to impress upon those visiting the horrific arena of war. Now you know.
Did you know that the state capitol is not only the epicenter of the Commonwealth's governing bodies, but was once home to 390 preserved Civil War flags? During the war, it was customary for each state to furnish their regiments in battle with flags representing their contribution to the Union Army. After the war, Pennsylvania's military department was responsible for collecting the flags, and in 1872 they were reverently housed in the Capitol. Following the completion of construction on the new Capitol building in 1914, the Civil War flags were moved to the Capitol Rotunda. They were kept untouched in custom-made flag cases until 1982, when the Capitol Preservation Committee initiated its Save the Flags project. Throughout the years, dust and long-term vertical display of the flags had begun to devastate the brittle silk fabric and painted designs. The flags were removed by local textile conservators and were repaired and preserved in storage units that protect the relics from light, dust, and excessive handling. Now you know.
Welcome back to the program. I'm State Representative Keith Gillespie. Joining me now is the Secretary of the Pennsylvania Department of Education, Ron Tamales. We're discussing the current state of education in the Commonwealth and possible improvements that can be made. Obviously, we have a lot of improvements we need to make to transportation, so my mind just broke off for a second. But obviously, education, as you related in the earlier segment, Secretary, 40% of our budget, or close to 40% of our budget is revolves towards the education of our youth. It's a big number.
It is a big number, and it's a number that grows every year. I mentioned before how it went from 13 to 26. Sure enough, 15 years from now, Representative, you may be sitting here with another Secretary of Education, and instead of talking about a $26 billion system, we're going to be talking about a $52 billion system. So that seems to be the constant. We need to change things as we address some of these important issues. Yeah.
Well, I think I can assure you that 15 years from now, I'll be sitting someplace else other than here, so and whoever is represented in the 47th District will address that. There are three groups in this equation that I'd like you to compare. First, how does the student of 2011 compare to the student of years past?
I would say a big difference between the student and looking at it from the perspective through the eyes of my kids, a 9-year-old and 11-year-old, is that they're extremely inquisitive, but what they need a little bit of help with is trying to filter out some of the information that they get. There's a lot of dynamics of how they gather information. In the old days, we used to go into a classroom and used to sit, and the information, the education, the material would be given to us. Now, kids can go find so many different pieces of information, which is a good thing. It's a great thing. They have access to so many different avenues. But at the same time, what an important skill is how to filter that information. So there's a difference between quantity and quality. when they engage in that learning experience, they want to focus on the quality information. Role of a good teacher, that's what teachers do. They're able to hone that in. I think also, to be quite honest with you, that there's a lot of different pressures involved in a student these days. They're thinking, especially in our secondary schools, and too many in our secondary schools, they're looking at the next step and the step after that a little bit too early. We need to focus on the level of learning a little bit more, in my mind, rather than just going through some of that process and looking to where they may end up to go in the post-secondary environment. But the one constant and the one thing between the kids of 20 and 30 years ago and maybe the kids of today is you need a base level of knowledge in order to succeed. In the old days, you could get by of graduating, of even dropping out of high school or coming out of college without a deep academic background, because there was an awful lot of jobs that were available to them, family-sustaining jobs that were available to them in the private sector. The level of information, the level of knowledge that you need now is so much deeper and richer that you really should stay in high school, in particular, perhaps even go on to a post-secondary environment, but get a higher quality academic underpinning in a couple of the key areas in order to succeed. Those are the differences and some of the similarities between those students.
Certainly, great points. Conversely, how does today's parent compare to the ones that you and I grew up with? I mean, I know I have a 17-year-old who's going to be a senior this year, and just with a number of the areas that you touched on, she'll come home and she'll talk about her day, and just it's a little bit different than when you and I went to school. Some of the core classes, yes, the English, the mathematics, and the sciences, but she's in the graphic arts and regular arts in general, and just a lot of different disciplines that she's responsible for, and the way that it's instructed, whether it's the internet or gaining access and getting information via, just rather than going down to the library and pulling out a card and researching it with a hard book.
The parents, the job of the parent, and remember that as my first job with my wife and I and our two kids, to me, probably a lot more difficult, but I think my mom and my parents and your parents would probably say the same thing. For their job was kind of tough too. We live in a busy world. We have a lot of pressures on us every day, and as parents, we're being pulled in a lot of different directions. How do we make sure that education that our child is receiving is a quality education? And how do you filter through all the dynamics that's coming out and all the different distractions that are happening? I think actually what's going to be fascinating is a different dynamic, not that one that's taken place in the last 5 years, but one that's going to be taking place over the next 5 or 10 years. And that's what I call the new parent who's coming into our public education, our education system in general. We were very used to, when we were growing up, of walking up to a television screen and turning a dial and getting 13 channels on a TV screen. Or our music selection was probably side A or side B. Parents, particularly those 20 years and under, would never think of seeing something like that. They have 500 channels on a television. They have 10,000 songs at their finger, at their thumb. And what they grew up in is a completely different world than you or I grew up in, where it was a lot about individual choice and selections. And part of the learning process was trying to make the best selections of multiple choices. Now they're becoming parents, and they're going into a public education model where it's still this model that's worked so well with schools, curriculum, and teachers. And they're going to look for a new dynamic for their kids, a dynamic that may say, this is what my child loves, foreign languages, but not so much science. How do we balance that up, or vice versa? Or my child loves history, but wants to learn about Korea because the grandfather served in the Korean War, but we teach Revolutionary War and Civil War. How do you tap into that learning environment to meet the needs of the child? Parents, this new parent coming into the system is going to be quite an antagonist against our public education system to marry up those needs for their, as moms and dads, for their kids, and what we have always, in the way that we have always provided it.
Yeah, interesting point. I know one thing that's still important to my wife and I are the back to school nights and the meet with the teachers. That's something that seems like it's been around since probably the first walls went up. But I think that connection with who is dealing with our children during a majority of their day is important, and to be able to offer that input and feedback back to the teachers.
Good point. I often say that the teacher is actually, and in too many circumstances, the teacher is the adult that child sees more than any other person during the course of the day. And it wasn't too long ago when I was sitting in those chairs about this high off the ground and at my own parent-teacher conferences. So it's important that we make sure that the parents are engaged as much as possible. And that from the public education environment, it's an inviting environment for those parents to become engaged.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, getting down close to the end here, one thing I just wanted to talk on the role of today's teachers, and we had talked briefly during the break about teacher effectiveness and the corporate administration's goal to look at various evaluations and so forth with that process as we get towards the end of our program here today.
More and more the research is showing us it's not the per pupil amount, not how much money we spend. It's even not class size that determines the quality of education. It's the quality of that teacher standing in front of those kids. Think of it. Would you rather have your son or daughter in a class with 25 kids and a high quality teacher, or in 22 kids with a so-so teacher? Now what we need to do is identify the great teachers, and we have a lot of them in Pennsylvania schools, and reward them and address their needs. But we also need to identify teachers who are falling a little bit short and get them the professional development services and some of the other tools to help get their instructional abilities up so that they can handle those kids and help drive that educational achievement. So we're going to be putting in place over the next couple of years a new teacher evaluation system that gets to the heart of that matter.
Okay, well, we look forward to hearing more on that. That's all the time we have for today's program. I'm State Representative Keith Gillespie. If you need assistance with any state government matter, feel free to contact me at my local office or through my website. That information will be shown in a moment. Thanks for watching, and please join me next time for Legislative Report.